Rain poured down the dark, empty streets as a lone figure hurried through the shadows, glancing anxiously over his shoulder. This was Nathan Pearson's last desperate attempt to escape the clutches of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, an organization he had once blindly trusted, but which had now turned against him in the most ruthless manner. Clutching an envelope containing damning evidence, Nathan darted between the flickering streetlights, his heart pounding. He knew that if the HOA uncovered what was in that envelope, his life would be over. They would stop at nothing to bury the truth and maintain their iron grip on the community. As Nathan rounded a corner, a pair of headlights suddenly illuminated the night, forcing him to freeze. A sleek black SUV pulled up, its tinted windows concealing the occupants. Nathan's breath caught in his throat as the driver's side door swung open and a tall, imposing figure emerged. "Mr. Pearson," the man said, his voice calm yet laced with menace, "the HOA has been looking for you." Nathan's mind raced, searching for a way out, but he knew he was trapped. These people had eyes and ears everywhere, and they would pursue him relentlessly until they got what they wanted. Steeling himself, he stood his ground, clutching the envelope tightly. "I have evidence," he said, his voice quivering slightly. "Evidence of your corruption, your manipulation of the rules, your abuse of power. I'm going to expose you all." The man in the suit simply chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound that sent a chill down Nathan's spine. "You really think you can win against the HOA?" he said, taking a step closer. "We own this community, Mr. Pearson. We make the rules and we decide who follows them. And you," his eyes narrowed, "you've broken too many of them." Before Nathan could react, the man lunged forward, his hands closing around Nathan's throat. Nathan struggled, gasping for air, but the man's grip was unyielding. As his vision began to blur, Nathan knew he was running out of time. Summoning the last of his strength, he managed to thrust the envelope into the man's face, causing him to stumble back in surprise. Nathan seized the opportunity, turning and running as fast as he could, his lungs burning with the effort. Behind him, he could hear the man shouting orders into a phone and the sound of a car engine roaring to life. Nathan knew he couldn't outrun them, but he had to try. He had to get that evidence to someone who could use it to bring down the HOA's reign of terror. As he ran, Nathan's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. He couldn't go home. The HOA would be waiting for him there. He had to find a safe place, somewhere he could hide and plan his next move. But where? The streets were deserted, the only sound the pounding of the rain and the distant hum of the SUV's engine. Nathan's legs were growing weary, and he knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted a dim light shining through a window up ahead. A sense of hope surged through him, and he pushed on, desperate to reach that light and find shelter. As he drew closer, he could see that it was a small, nondescript building. A church, perhaps, or a community center. Without hesitation, Nathan pushed open the door and hurried inside, praying that he had finally found a safe haven from the relentless pursuit of the HOA. But as the door swung shut behind him, Nathan knew that his troubles were far from over. The battle had only just begun. The air inside the building was musty and thick with the scent of old wood and stale incense. Nathan's footsteps echoed as he crept forward, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins from his desperate escape. As he moved deeper into the building, he noticed that it was not a church, but rather a small community center. Rows of folding chairs were neatly arranged, and a worn-out banner hung on the wall, advertising a local charity event. Nathan's breath caught in his throat as he heard the sound of voices coming from a nearby room. Quickly, he ducked behind a stack of boxes, his fingers gripping the envelope tightly. He strained to listen, his heart racing. "Can't keep this up much longer," a gruff voice said. "The HOA is getting suspicious. We need to move faster." I know," another voice replied, this one smoother and more confident. "But we have to be careful. One wrong move, and it's all over." Nathan's eyes widened as he realized that these were the voices of the HOA's associates, the people who were pulling the strings behind the scenes. He listened intently, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what they were planning. Suddenly, the voices fell silent, and Nathan held his breath, praying that he hadn't been discovered. A moment later, the sound of footsteps echoed through the building, and Nathan knew that he had to move. Slowly, he emerged from his hiding place, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an exit. As he made his way toward the door, a floorboard creaked beneath his feet, and he froze, his heart pounding. He heard the sound of a door opening, and then a voice called out, "Who's there?" Without hesitation, Nathan turned and ran, his feet pounding against the wooden floor as he raced toward the exit. He could hear the sound of pursuit behind him, the footsteps of his pursuers growing closer with every step. As he burst out into the night, the rain lashing against his face, Nathan knew that he had to keep moving. He couldn't go home, and he couldn't trust anyone in the community. The HOA had eyes and ears everywhere, and they were determined to silence him. He ran through the streets, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind racing as he tried to figure out where he could go. He had to find a way to get the evidence to someone who could help him. Someone who could take down the HOA and its corrupt leaders. As he turned the corner, he caught sight of a familiar face, his neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, a kind old woman who had always been kind to him. Without thinking, Nathan ran up to her, his eyes wild with desperation. "Mrs. Thompson," he cried, "you have to help me. The HOA, they're after me, and they've got people everywhere." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened with alarm, and she quickly ushered Nathan inside her house, shutting the door behind them. "What's going on, Nathan?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nathan quickly explained what had happened, his hands shaking as he held out the envelope. "This is evidence of the HOA's corruption," he said. "You'd have to get it to someone who can use it to take them down. They'll stop at nothing to keep their power, and they'll come after me if they find out I have this." Mrs. Thompson's face paled, and she quickly took the envelope, her fingers trembling. "I'll do what I can, Nathan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to be careful. They're watching everyone." Nathan nodded, his heart pounding. He knew that he was putting Mrs. Thompson at risk, but he had no other choice. He had to trust that she would do the right thing, and that the evidence would be enough to bring down the HOA's reign of terror. As he turned to leave, a sudden chill ran down his spine. He could feel the weight of the HOA's presence like a dark cloud that hung over the entire community. The battle had only just begun, and he knew that he was in for the fight of his life. Nathan's mind raced as he hurried through the rain-soaked streets, his clothes clinging to his body and his heart pounding with fear. The weight of the evidence he had entrusted to Mrs. Thompson seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders, a constant reminder of the high stakes he was playing for. He knew that the HOA would stop at nothing to retrieve that envelope, and that his neighbor's act of kindness had placed her in grave danger. The thought of the powerful organization's reach and ruthlessness sent a chill down his spine, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake in trusting her. As he turned the corner, Nathan's eyes caught sight of a familiar black SUV parked on the street. His breath caught in his throat, and he quickly ducked behind a parked car, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. After a few tense moments, the driver's side door opened and a tall, imposing figure emerged. Nathan recognized him as the man from the earlier confrontation, the HOA's enforcer, but one who had tried to choke the life out of him. The man strode towards the community center, his steps purposeful and his expression unreadable. Nathan knew that he had to move quickly if he wanted to stay one step ahead of the HOA's pursuit. Cautiously, he emerged from his hiding place and began to follow the man, his footsteps as quiet as he could manage. He knew that he was taking a huge risk, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the evidence he had handed over to Mrs. Thompson was the key to bringing down the HOA's corrupt regime. As he approached the community center, Nathan could hear the sound of muffled voices coming from within. He crept closer, his heart pounding in his chest, and peered through a grimy window. Inside, he could see the HOA enforcer speaking animatedly with a group of men, their faces obscured in the dim light. Nathan strained to hear their conversation, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what was happening. "Can't let him get away," the enforcer was saying, his voice low and urgent. "That envelope could ruin everything." One of the other men nodded, his expression grim. "We'll tear this place apart if we have to. That evidence has to be destroyed no matter what." Nathan's eyes widened with horror as he realized the true extent of the HOA's corruption. They were willing to go to any lengths to keep their secrets hidden, even if it meant resorting to violence and intimidation. Suddenly, the sound of a door opening caught his attention, and he quickly ducked out of sight. He watched as the group of men filed out of the community center, their expressions tense and determined. Once they had gone, Nathan cautiously made his way to the front door, his fingers trembling as he reached for the handle. He had to warn Mrs. Thompson to make sure that the envelope was in safe hands. But as he pushed the door open, he was met with a sight that made his heart sink. The small community center was in disarray, with chairs overturned and debris scattered across the floor. And in the center of it all, lying motionless on the ground, was Mrs. Thompson. Nathan rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. To his relief, she was still breathing, but she was unconscious, her face bruised and battered. As he knelt beside her, Nathan's mind raced with a mixture of fear and determination. He knew that the HOA had gone to extreme lengths to retrieve the evidence, and that they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. But he also knew that he couldn't give up. The envelope was still out there, and he had to find a way to get it to someone who could use it to bring down the HOA's corrupt regime. The stakes had never been higher, and Nathan was more determined than ever to see this fight through to the end. Nathan's heart raced as he knelt beside Mrs. Thompson's unconscious form, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The HOA had gone too far, their ruthless pursuit of the damning evidence he had entrusted to his neighbor, leaving her battered and bruised. Gently, he checked her pulse, relieved to find that it was still strong. Quickly, He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his fingers trembling as he relayed the address and urgently requested an ambulance. As he waited for help to arrive, Nathan's mind raced, trying to piece together his next move. The HOA had proven that they were willing to go to any lengths to retrieve the envelope, and he knew that he couldn't risk leading them directly to Mrs. Thompson's home. He had to find a way to get the evidence to someone else, someone who could use it to take down the corrupt organization. Glancing around the now ransacked community center, Nathan's eyes fell upon a battered old filing cabinet in the corner. An idea began to form in his mind, and he hurried over to it, his fingers fumbling with the drawer. Inside, he found a collection of old files and documents, some of them water-stained and torn. Quickly, he began to rummage through them, his heart racing as he searched for a suitable hiding place. Suddenly, his fingers brushed against the thin, worn envelope, and he paused, his eyes widening. Carefully, he pulled it out, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized the familiar handwriting on the front. "Mrs. Thompson," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He knew that this must have been where she had hidden the envelope, her quick thinking and resourcefulness having saved it from the HOA's prying eyes. Nathan wasted no time in carefully placing the envelope back in the filing cabinet, making sure to conceal it amongst the other documents. He knew that the HOA would be relentless in their search, and he had to make sure that the evidence remained hidden. Just as he was about to close the drawer, the sound of sirens in the distance caught his attention. Help was on the way, and he knew that he had to get out of there quickly before the HOA arrived. Casting one last glance at Mrs. Thompson, Nathan hurried towards the exit, his mind racing with a multitude of thoughts and emotions. He knew that he couldn't go home, that the HOA would be waiting for him there. He had to find a safe place to hide, somewhere he could plan his next move. As he stepped out into the rain-soaked streets, Nathan's eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of the black SUV or its occupants. To his relief, the streets were empty, and he quickly set off in the direction of the nearest bus stop, determined to put as much distance between himself and the HOA as possible. Once on the bus, Nathan settled into a seat near the back, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked windows. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach, the knowledge that the HOA was closing in on him weighing heavily on his mind. But even as the bus rumbled through the streets, Nathan knew that he couldn't give up. The evidence he had entrusted to Mrs. Thompson was the key to bringing down the corrupt organization, and he was determined to see this fight through to the end. As the bus pulled into the station, Nathan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges that lay ahead. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was more determined than ever to expose the HOA's secrets and reclaim his life. The bus station was bustling with activity as Nathan stepped out into the cool night air, his eyes darting around nervously. He knew that the HOA's reach extended far beyond the confines of the Willow Creek community, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were closing in on him. Keeping his head down, Nathan hurried through the crowd, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next move. He couldn't go back to his apartment. It was the first place the HOA would look for him. And he couldn't risk leading them to Mrs. Thompson's home, not after what they had done to her. As he walked, Nathan's fingers brushed against the worn envelope in his pocket, a glimmer of hope rising within him. The evidence was still safe, hidden in the filing cabinet at the community center. All he had to do was find a way to get it to someone who would use it to take down the HOA. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He remembered hearing about a local investigative journalist who had been digging into the shady dealings of the Willow Creek HOA. Maybe she could be the key to exposing the truth and bringing the organization down. Without hesitation, Nathan made his way to the nearest payphone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number he had found online. As the phone rang, he held his breath, praying that the journalist would be willing to listen to his story. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered, her tone cautious. "My name is Nathan Pearson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have information about the Willow Creek HOA that could expose their corruption. I need your help." There was a brief pause, and then the journalist's voice grew more urgent. "What kind of information, and why do you need my help?" Nathan quickly explained the situation, his words tumbling out in a rush as he tried to convey the gravity of the situation. He told her about the envelope, the evidence he had entrusted to Mrs. Thompson, and the HOA's ruthless pursuit of him. "This is big," the journalist said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and concern. "If what you're saying is true, then we could be looking at a major scandal. But you need to be careful. The HOA is not going to let this go easily." Nathan nodded, even though he knew she couldn't see him. "I understand. That's why I need your help. I can't risk going back to the community center, and I can't lead the HOA to Mrs. Thompson's door. But the evidence is still there, hidden in a filing cabinet. You have to get it and use it to bring them down." The journalist was silent for a moment, and Nathan could almost feel the wheels turning in her mind. "All right," she said finally. "I'll do it. But you need to stay out of sight, Nathan. The HOA is dangerous, and they won't hesitate to come after you if they find out you're involved. Nathan let out a sigh of relief, his fingers tightening around the phone. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'll do whatever it takes to help you. Just please get that evidence and use it to take down the HOA." The journalist promised to act quickly, and with that, the call ended. Nathan stood there for a moment, his mind racing with a mixture of hope and anxiety. He knew that he was putting a lot of trust in this stranger, but he had no other choice. The HOA had to be stopped, and the evidence he had uncovered was the key to doing it. Steeling himself, Nathan set off into the night, determined to find a safe place to hide until the journalist could retrieve the envelope. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was more determined than ever to see this fight through to the end. The rain had let up, but the air was still thick with tension as Nathan made his way through the dimly lit streets of the city. His mind raced with a million thoughts, each one more anxious than the last. Had the journalist been able to retrieve the envelope from the filing cabinet? Was Mrs. Thompson all right? And most importantly, was the HOA closing in on him, ready to pounce at the first sign of his location? Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, his eyes darting around nervously as he walked. He knew that the HOA had eyes and ears everywhere, and that they wouldn't rest until they had reclaimed the damning evidence he had entrusted to his neighbor. As he turned the corner, he caught sight of a familiar figure in the distance, a tall, imposing man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. Nathan's heart sank as he recognized the HOA enforcer, the same man who had tried to choke the life out of him. Without hesitation, Nathan ducked behind a parked car, his fingers digging into the door handle as he waited, his breath caught in his throat. The enforcer passed by, his steps purposeful and his gaze scanning the area, and Nathan let out a sigh of relief. But the respite was short-lived. As he moved to continue on his way, a sudden movement in the shadows caught his eye, and he froze, his heart pounding. A second figure emerged, this one shorter and slighter, but no less menacing. "Well, look who we have here," a woman's voice drawled, her tone dripping with malice. The HOA's little troublemaker. Nathan's eyes widened as he recognized the woman. It was Meredith, the HOA's vice president, and the driving force behind many of the organization's most draconian policies. "What do you want?" Nathan asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound confident. Meredith's lips curled into a sinister smile. "What do I want?" she echoed. "I want the evidence you stole from us, that's what I want." Nathan's mind raced, trying to come up with a way to stall or distract her. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his fingers tightening around the envelope in his pocket. Meredith's eyes narrowed, and in a flash, she had produced a sleek black handgun, pointing it directly at Nathan's chest. "Don't play dumb with me, Pearson," she hissed. "We know you have it, and we're going to make sure it never sees the light of day." Nathan's heart pounded in his ears as he stared down the barrel of the gun, his mind racing with a million scenarios, each one more dire than the last. He knew that he couldn't outrun her, not with the enforcer lurking in the shadows. Just as he was about to surrender, a familiar voice rang out, echoing through the deserted street. "Drop the gun, Meredith." Nathan's head snapped towards the sound, and his eyes widened as he recognized the figure standing there. It was the journalist, her face set in a determined expression as she leveled a gun of her own at the HOA vice president. Meredith's eyes darted between the two of them, her grip on the gun wavering. "You don't understand," she hissed. "The HOA is everything. I can't let you destroy it." The journalist's finger tightened on the trigger, her voice steady and resolute. "It's too late for that, Meredith. The evidence is out, and the world is going to know the truth about your corruption." For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the only sound the pounding of Nathan's heart. And then, with a snarl of rage, Meredith fired, the crack of the gun echoing through the night. The world seemed to slow down as the bullet ripped through the air, Nathan's heart pounding in his chest. He watched, frozen in terror, as the journalist desperately tried to dodge the shot, her own gun raised and ready to return fire. The impact was deafening, the sound echoing through the deserted street as the journalist stumbled backward, her free hand clutching her shoulder. Nathan could see the blood seeping through her fingers, and a wave of panic washed over him. Meredith, her face twisted in a triumphant sneer, turned her attention back to Nathan, her gun still raised. "Time to end this little game," she hissed, her finger tightening on the trigger. But before she could fire, a sudden movement in the shadows caught her attention, and Nathan watched as the HOA enforcer lunged forward, tackling Meredith to the ground. The gun clattered to the pavement, and for a moment, the three of them were locked in a desperate struggle. Nathan seized the opportunity, rushing to the journalist's side. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. The journalist grimaced in pain, but her expression was determined. "I'm fine," she gritted out. "You need to get out of here. The evidence is safe, but you have to keep it that way." Nathan shook his head, his mind racing. "I can't leave you," he said, his eyes darting back to the ongoing scuffle between Meredith and the enforcer. "You have to," the journalist insisted, her voice growing weaker. This is bigger than either of us. The HOA has to be stopped, and that means you have to keep the evidence safe." Nathan hesitated, his fingers tightening around the envelope in his pocket. He knew that the journalist was right, that the evidence was the key to taking down the HOA's corrupt regime. But he couldn't bring himself to abandon her, not when she had risked everything to help him. Just then, a sharp cry rang out, and Nathan looked up to see Meredith scrambling to her feet, the enforcer lying motionless on the ground. Her eyes narrowed as she caught sight of Nathan and the journalist, and she began to advance towards them, her face twisted in a snarl of rage. "Give me that envelope, Pearson," she screamed, her voice laced with fury. "I won't let you ruin everything I've worked for." Nathan's heart raced, his mind scrambling for a way out. He knew that he couldn't outrun Meredith, not with the journalist injured and unable to move, but he also knew that he couldn't let the evidence fall into the HOA's hands. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Nathan stepped in front of the journalist, shielding her from Meredith's advances. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, his voice trembling but his gaze unwavering. Meredith let out a derisive laugh, her gun trained on Nathan's chest. "Don't be a fool, Pearson. You can't win against the HOA. We have eyes and ears everywhere, and we always get what we want." Nathan stood his ground, his fingers tightening around the envelope. "Maybe," he said, his voice calm despite the turmoil raging within him. "But this time you're going to have to pry it from my cold, dead hands." Meredith's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Nathan thought she was going to pull the trigger. But then a sudden flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, and she hesitated, her grip on the gun wavering. In that moment, Nathan saw his chance. Without a moment's hesitation, he lunged forward, his shoulder slamming into Meredith's chest and sending her stumbling backward. The gun clattered to the ground, and Nathan snatched it up, his finger poised on the trigger. "It's over, Meredith," he said, his voice filled with a newfound confidence. "The HOA's reign of terror ends here." Meredith's eyes widened, and for the first time, Nathan saw the fear in her eyes. She knew that she had lost, that the evidence she had fought so hard to suppress was now beyond her reach. As the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, Nathan knew that the battle was far from over. But for now, the envelope was safe, and the HOA's corruption was about to be exposed to the world. The air was thick with tension as Nathan stood his ground, the stolen gun pointed firmly at Meredith's chest. The HOA vice president's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and defiance, her hands raised in a show of surrender. Behind him, Nathan could hear the faint sounds of sirens, the approaching wail of the police, a reminder that the tides were turning against the HOA's corrupt regime. But even as relief began to wash over him, a sense of unease gnawed at the back of his mind. Meredith wasn't the type to give up easily, and Nathan knew that she would stop at nothing to protect the HOA's interests. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not when so much was at stake. "It's over, Meredith," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "The evidence is out, and the world is going to know the truth about your organization's crimes." Meredith's lips curled into a sardonic smile, her gaze unflinching. "You really think it's that simple, Pearson?" She spat. "The HOA has been around for decades, and we've weathered worse storms than this. You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over." Nathan felt a chill run down his spine, her words, his grip on the gun tightening. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. Meredith's smile only grew wider, a spark of malice glinting in her eyes. "You think that envelope is the only evidence we have," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "The HOA has eyes and ears everywhere, Pearson. We've been preparing for this day for years, and we have contingency plans in place to ensure that our power remains intact." Nathan felt his heart sink as the realization dawned on him. The HOA had been one step ahead of him the entire time, anticipating his every move and laying the groundwork for a counterattack. The envelope he had risked so much to protect might not be enough to bring them down after all. "You're bluffing," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "The evidence in that envelope is damning. The authorities will have no choice but to investigate and shut down your corrupt organization." Meredith let out a cold, mirthless laugh. "Oh, Pearson, you really are a knave fool," she said. "The authorities are already in our pocket. They know better than to cross the HOA." Nathan's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The very people who were supposed to protect the law were in league with the HOA. The fight he had thought he was winning was in reality a losing battle. Just then, the sound of sirens grew louder, and Nathan knew that he had to act quickly. He couldn't let Meredith escape, not when the evidence was so close to being exposed. With a surge of determination, he took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It doesn't matter what you say, Meredith," he said, his voice laced with resolve. "I'm not going to let you get away with this." Meredith's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Nathan thought he saw a flicker of fear in her expression. But just as quickly, it was replaced by a cold, calculated determination. "You don't understand, Pearson," she said, her voice low and dangerous. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. The HOA is the foundation of this community, and we will do whatever it takes to protect it." Before Nathan could react, Meredith made her move, lunging forward with a speed that took him by surprise. In a desperate attempt to stop her, Nathan pulled the trigger, the deafening sound of the gunshot echoing through the night. As Meredith's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, Nathan stood there, his heart pounding and his mind reeling. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. With a heavy sigh, he turned to the journalist, who was watching the scene unfold with a mix of horror and relief. "It's not over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The HOA has more tricks up their sleeve, and we're going to have to be even more vigilant if we want to take them down for good." The journalist nodded, her eyes filled with a renewed determination. "Then let's get to work," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "This is only the beginning."